get some sound from this? Yes, I do. Please have a seat and get comfortable. Would you like to say a word or two?
Thank you very much for coming to the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. Today we're very glad to have our two-part panel about translation. What exactly is lost and what's exactly found when we translate poetry or perhaps other fictional works? Today we're very glad to have a full panel from left, like Lucas Fine, Natasha Bruce, our moderator, Professor Han Sossi, and Jennifer Beatty and Tammy Ho. I'll leave it to Han Sossi to moderate the event, and if you do want to stay for the second panel, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Welcome everyone. I will try to remember to speak into the microphone. We have here with us tonight 4 translators working principally in Chinese and English, although I know some of them have other affinities with other languages. We have people who specialize in translating poetry and people who translate fiction. So a good assortment of literary goods. Before we get started though, I would like to say a little word or two about translators. Translators are admirable people. They don't believe in walls. The really good ones among them can even walk through walls. They make nations, languages, cultures, generations, different sorts of people communicate. And to the extent that we can ever know what it's like to be in someone else's skin, translators make a lot of that happen. So I feel that tonight in particular, we need to salute the work of translators. And so in that spirit, let's begin. I've asked the translators here to begin by reading us a little sample of their work. That is a poem or a passage from a prose work that posed some particular challenge that we can then talk about. What was it about that passage that was difficult or intriguing? What was it that perhaps resisted being carried over into another language? And Tammy, if you don't mind, maybe we can start with you since you're on the end. All right, so just read us a little passage and then we'll keep on going until we've had them all, and then we'll bring it back for a little conversation.
Thank you for being here tonight. I thought before I read a poem I translated, I would like to say a few words about my own background. I'm not a very prolific translator, and actually translation is something I do in addition to teaching, doing research. So I mainly translate when I find time, and I would ask my friends to give me some works to translate. And so my observations the observations that I'm going to make tonight are not necessarily from the perspective of a professional translator, but someone who's very interested in the art and practice of translation, and also trying to learn more. I'm going to read a poem I translated, and this is published in Pathlight, and the issue is actually themed Lost and Found, so it echoes the theme of tonight. And it is a poem by the poet Chen Xianfa. And the title is Golden Sparrows. In my mouth is a country about to explode. Whose breeze is it blowing through the city's alleyways? Early morning, people circle a huge furnace fire after they've flushed the toilets. Whose secret formula is it that can open the breast and pour flocks of sparrows into the wok? The walk is indeed the most ancient poem. Little can survive its acidic fluids, except the sparrow. It witnesses a new world inside, wherein officials are golden, the system is golden, barefoot is golden. When sprinkled with salt, the old sparrows still remember to give thanks. Golden willow embankment, golden wilderness. When I was a child, I climbed the electric wires in the hall to squat with the sparrows in idleness. I knew nothing of hiding, even when a windstorm came. Quietly, we counted the future words crackling in the walk. Those sparrows who can't afford to see the doctor, those sparrows who sew shoes all night under gaslight, those sparrows who sell their blood to pay their children's tuition, those crippled sparrows who hawk balloons in the park, those sparrows who roast sweet potatoes, those pensioned sparrows with green veins on their faces, the prostitute sparrow who writes nightly letters for her wayward brothers, the sparrows who swirl under neon signs, they all become the nation's breakfast. That sparrow in the pen is still tightly keeping her letters. Whose breeze blowing everything? Whose veins? Postmen are golden. The remembered thanks is golden. Breakfast is golden. Thank you.
So Han had asked us to pick a piece that we feel encapsulates some of the challenges we find in translation and maybe reflects who we are as a translator. So of course that's very hard to do because maybe you face a lot of problems, but they're all in different works or different passages. But I decided to read a poem that I translated by the Hong Kong writer Xi, who many of you maybe know better as a fiction writer. And I'm going to read a poem called Crab Canon, and if you don't know what a crab canon is, it's actually a musical term. So Bach wrote a lot of these, and basically it's a piece of music that could go on infinitely because you get to the midpoint and it starts repeating backwards. And people began writing poems called crab canons, which are basically palindrome line poems. And I thought it'd be interesting to pick this poem because there's a lot of challenges, as you'll see, with wordplay and puns, rhymes, and the rhythm. And it seems to be a very light-hearted poem, but it's actually a poem about political protest, which seems very appropriate for Hong Kong right now. Crab Canon. Come on, come on, come and dance the crab canon. White crabs in front, black crabs behind, red crabs to the left, green crabs to the right. Foot to foot, hand in hand, they stand. Zig, zig, zag, sidle and slide. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once I caught a crab alive. Councils convene inside. Protesters stampede outside. Left foot, left foot, right. Apple pie, love at first bite. Which pie in the sky has the sights that delight? Come on, come on, come and dance the crab canon. In the spirit of humanity, it's your civic responsibility. The pros and cons of cons conning pros. Little Miss Pint Size, early to rise, off to the square to where the slogans flare. Come on, come on, come and dance the crab canon. Off to the square to where the slogans flare. Early to rise, Little Miss Pint Size. The cons and pros of pros conning cons. It's your civic responsibility in the spirit of humanity. Come on, come on, come and dance the crab canon. Which pie in the sky has the sights that delight? Apple pie, love at first bite. Right foot, left foot, right. Protesters stampede outside. Councils convene inside. Once I caught a crab alive. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Zig, zig, zag, sidle and slide. Foot to foot, hand in hand, they stand. Green crabs to the left, red crabs to the right, black crabs in front, white crabs behind. Come on, come on, come and dance the crab cannon.
Thank you.
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'm the outlier in this lineup because I do not translate poetry, or at least as of yet I have not dared to try to translate poetry. So I'm going to read a piece of prose or an extract from a piece of prose. And I think I agree with Jen that it's quite hard to identify one piece that encapsulates all the challenges that you encounter. I had the idea, especially with prose, because you've just got more words to work with usually. So I decided to just pick the story that I think I found the most challenging of all the stories that I've translated. So this is a story called The Cat by a Shanghai writer called Gu Xian. And definitely when I was translating it, then I found myself writing a lot of emails to friends describing it as basically 8,000 characters of first-person crazy cat lady rant. And I think it's a really beautiful story. I really like it, but I do think it's basically a crazy cat lady rant. And so it has a few introductory paragraphs which are in what I would call normal sentences saying that she bought a cat and then the cat went missing. But after the first two paragraphs, it devolves gradually and then faster and faster into really, really long sentences that kind of start to get less and less coherent. There's less and less narrative, and it starts jumping between subjects and jumping between locations and tenses. And so eventually, then on the last couple of pages, it's a lot of different sounds as well as words. So you kind of eventually aren't really sure whether she's maybe the cat or all that much what's going on. So I thought I would read the last two paragraphs so you can see how it ends up. Clatter, clatter went the train. Coo, coo went the loudspeaker on the ceiling. Announcements were stuck to the walls. One carriage is full of pigeons. I shook the dried catnip out of my pockets. There was quite a bit of it, enough to stuff a pillow, and so I stuffed a pillow. Sleeping is wonderful, but waking up without sadness is better. There were I don't know how many carriages left that I hadn't visited. If I had to keep on living, I wanted to live like a pioneer, so I had to leave myself plenty of room to explore. The train crossed a bridge. The train dived into a mountain tunnel. It whistled, meow, hoo. It breathed a pale pink mist and scuttled up and down along its roller coaster tracks. I liked that we weren't anywhere at all, always leaving, going nowhere. Dearest Mom, traveling is so much fun. I'm totally hooked. My carriage is warm, the conductor is a good man, and so long as nothing holds us up along the way, we keep on at a very good pace. If I could have chosen to be anywhere, I'd have wished to be inside my cat. I looked through the window at the sky, the scenery, the kids getting out of school and their anxious fathers, fields, Andy Lau and his little barber shop, rivers of traffic and well-lit homes, birds fending for themselves, friends making dumplings, tortoises struggling along, vagrants crying by the river, middle-aged women dressed in loud colours, fan dancers, something dangling from a power line and shimmering in the sunlight like magnetic tape unspooled from a cassette, who knows what recorded on it. The persimmon's ripe and the noodles smelling good. The loudspeaker playing a song. Kitty, kitty, our friend Kitty, our dear friend Kitty, spread your pure white wings, fly in circles around our boat. The train stopped at a station, and I didn't see his face, but I knew he was watching me inquiringly, and I said, "No, I'm not getting off." He gave a little cheer and ran away.
Thank you.
This is a poem by Sichuan from a book called Notes on the Mosquito that was published in 2012, I think?
I think you were.
Time flies, 2012. This is called The Distance for Ana Akhmatova. There was a snowfield in a dream. There was a white birch in the snowfield. There was a small house that will resound in prayer. There was a shingle that will fall off the North Star in the distance. There was a crowd of commoners as purple as red cabbage. There was a pot of boiled water that was lapped up by animals. There was a wooden chair caught in recollection. There was a desk lamp whose illumination represents me in the distance. Words I can't read written on glass, soybeans and sorghum grow on a blank page. A face that makes me put down my pen. When I pick it up again, the ink's frozen solid in the distance. Roving clouds of December rise off tree limbs. The train of my soul stops in the cold. On a cold road I see me walking. At a girl's door I cough 3 times.
All right, so now we're not talking about translation really in the abstract. We've got some examples in front of us. And I'd like to ask you about another delicate question of translation, which is how you develop a voice for the writer in the language that you're working in. Right? Isn't that a rather delicate thing? Because it can't just be your voice. You're in a way acting on behalf of somebody, the way that, say, lawyers or surgeons have to make decisions on behalf of someone who may not be in a position to make those decisions. So how do you do it technically, and how do you do it as a matter of your conscience, let's say? Should we start with you, maybe?
Right.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's just always there's an element of instinct to it, I think, for sure, of just reading a piece through and trying to get the words of the Chinese in your head to see what patterns it makes when you listen to it in Chinese. And so I think, to me, that's probably the biggest part. I mean, what else can you do, really? You can ask people for their opinion, but I do think instinct is the main thing. And I think in terms of the conscience part of it, that's a whole other enormous thing, isn't it? Because I think definitely when I first started translating literature rather than any other kind of language, I think I was really intimidated by that thought, by the idea that an author was entrusting me with their work, because that must be kind of terrifying as an author. But I think you have to kind of keep it in mind, but in order to be able to do the work, you have to put it to one side and just trust that if you do your best, if you hit things that you don't understand or aren't sure about, of course you have to check with the author or check with other people, but yeah, ultimately you have to just make sure that you're trying as hard as you can.
What do you think, Jennifer?
For me, it depends on what I'm translating, and by that I mean sometimes you're doing one-off projects, like a journal asks you to translate a few poems or a story. But with this book, because it was a book, it's different because you develop a more serious relationship, right? It's not just a fling, right? You're really involved. And I had known Xixi first as a fiction writer, so I'd read a lot of her stories and some of her novels. And I'd read a lot of criticism of her work and fan pages about her work. And so I had a sense of how I thought she was received. And I was able to latch on to the fact that she's very playful and very sensitive, but that can be deceptive because she's actually talking about some very serious things. But what I discovered with her work is everything is different. So she has this idea that every piece she writes should be different, either in form or content. So she won't write the same kind of novel twice, or the same kind of story, or the same kind of poem. So when I read multiple poems of hers publicly, people say those are by the same author because they're so vastly different. So that makes it sort of challenging, but I tried to latch on to what I mentioned, the things that I think are important, which is her sensitivity and her sense of play, and hope that I'm replicating that in English. But I think Natasha's right, a lot of it is instinct. This is, I think, where the artistry comes in, because a dictionary isn't going to help you with tone or diction. But when I'm doing shorter projects, I don't get a chance to develop as much of a relationship with the author. So then it really is pure instinct and going with the text and hoping you've got the voice right.
Recently I was teaching the book 19 Ways of Looking at One Way. And the author, one of the authors, Elliot Weinberger, he's presenting different translations of a very famous Chinese poem. And he also adds his own analysis, criticism of these translations. And one thing that he definitely dislikes is when translators improve the originals. So he points out areas where all these different translators, they try to make the original better. For me, when I'm translating poems, I don't have I haven't translated a lot of poems, but But for me, an ideal translation of a poem would be in the target language, say from Chinese to English. In English, the poem would appear to be as close to the so-called original as possible in terms of content, language devices, humor, tone, language register, so on and so forth. And I'm very also aware of how this way of translation brings into the problem of seeing one text being the original, whereas the translation is the copy, is the clone, is a version, is a variation. And but I think for the first instance, for example, this is what I would like to achieve, or what I look at in a translation. That is does it convey what the original poem tries to convey, the sense, the tone, the atmosphere, the feeling. But I also feel that as a translator, it would be more challenging to find poems that have language patterns or use of expressions that are very different from my own, from a different language. I have actually written down something said by a translator, a young translator, Henry Leung. He was a Fulbright scholar in Hong Kong in 2014, and he's just recently translated a collection of poems from Chinese into English. And he said that all translators love poems that are the most difficult to translate. I don't know if you agree with that. I actually don't agree with that. but it is a challenging process, an interesting process. So I think, to answer your question, I think for me as a translator, I would try to be as faithful, accurate, loyal as possible, while I'm very aware of the criticism about accuracy, loyalty, and faithfulness, but also to perhaps to be playful and surprising, like Jennifer's translation of Cece's poems, a lot of them.
Lucas, thank you.
I don't. I think it's a real live question, and it's something that I always kind of figure have to worry about. I think the approach that I have when I translate something is that I'm not expressing myself. I'm expressing someone else. This is not about me. This is not about my voice. This is not even about my interpretation. It's about somebody else. So I think of it as kind of a Zen exercise of the suppression of the ego. I have enough ego in the rest of my life that the translation sort of it can have that kind of almost ritualistic kind of intent. I can never eliminate myself completely. It all does filter through my own consciousness, but my attempt is to not have this be about me at all. And acknowledging that that's never completely perfect, but that's what I'm aiming for. How do I get voice there? English and Chinese are such different languages that can be a very hard thing to do. But I do have certain tactics and techniques. I've noticed that after translating this whole book, which took years, and I've gotten to know Sichuan very well as a person. I've heard him read and so on. I've read with him. So I can hear his voice, I can hear his voice speaking, I can hear his voice reciting as I translate. It's also now, if I do a new Sichuan poem, that's much easier for me to do. I need to do fewer drafts of that to get it to the place where I think it needs to be than I do when I'm doing like a one-off kind of piece, as Jennifer said, or when I start translating a new work by a poet that I haven't worked on as much. I've also now begun translating the work of a poet named Ouyang Jianghe, who's a friend of Sichuan. And that's much harder because I need to develop that voice in a way that doesn't make me feel like it's my voice. One thing I've found is that when I translate Sichuan, I'm more likely to use Germanic words. When I translate Ouyang Jianghe, I'm more likely to use Latinate words. I think there's something in the words that they use in Chinese that makes that kind of switch easier for me. So, if I'm translating Sichuan, I'm more likely to say something like hug. And if I translate Ouyang Jianghe, I'm more likely to say embrace, that kind of thing. As far as that kind of creating, what Tammy talked about this sort of ethic of fidelity may create an idea where, the original gets sort of consecrated, and then every translation is a copy, and then gets devalued because of that. My way around that is that I look at translation as, I want my translation to be good enough that people think that people might think that the source text is a translation of my translation, right? I think that if you can look at a text in two languages and you can tell without knowing for sure, which one was the source text and which one is the translation, then probably it's not a very good translation, right? When just down the hall, you've got the restrooms here, and it says male toilet. Well, that's not the way that we call that where I come from. Toilets cannot be male or female. So I know, right, that the Chinese came first, and English is the translation. But if you can't tell, then it's probably better. So I'm looking for my version to do a few things. I want it not to express me, but I want it to be good enough on its own so that readers will appreciate it, but also that readers who can read the source text might think that the source text is a translation of my translation. Those are my goals for what I want my translations to be. That's what I'm aiming for.
Can I follow up on something you said? Because it reminded me of how I sometimes think about translation, is I think of it like method acting. So that can be kind of creepy. We have some local writers in the audience who might find this disturbing, but I start to really feel like I'm imitating, not just in my work, but in my life, the writer I'm translating. So when I was translating Shishi, I would find myself buying like a tote bag with Magritte paintings on it, because she read these stories about Magritte. Or I bought this cute umbrella with these cats on it. You can see she drew cats, for the cover. And I think it was unconscious. It wasn't like I'm going to buy this because Shishi would like it, but it just, I don't know how it happened, and I realized I think of it kind of like...
I better stop translating Baudelaire.
Exactly. Be careful who you translate.
Find a healthy poet to translate.
I didn't know there were healthy poets.
Well, there must be some of them somewhere. Lucas, you said something that maybe others want to pick up on too, and that's how in translating different writers, you're appealing to different registers of the English language, right? Going for Germanic words versus Latin words, but of course, in the language that you're translating from, there isn't quite that same sort of thing, right? You don't have different language families that have a very different affective tone. So that's interesting too, that in some way, translation is also a process of discovery of the language that you're writing in, right? Of what we call the target language. Right? And I'm interested in that, right? Because that's one of those unpredictable consequences of translation that I think we need to be aware of. And one of the things that distinguishes translation from just a faithful copy of an original. Right? Have any of you all had the experience of discovering something about English that you didn't know until you were translating something from Chinese?
I think I might be a little bit different kind of translator. I'm more comfortable with translating from Chinese to English.
Or, in that case, does English reveal anything about Chinese to you? Through the process of translating?
Yes, a lot of the times I try to, because of the two very different cultures, translating poems in Chinese into English. I sometimes feel that I need to be quite creative in explaining certain ideas into English, but also this is a dilemma, I suppose, how I do not want to reduce the original ideas into something that is ideas that are too simplistic in the target language. I'm not quite sure if what I'm saying makes sense to you. But to begin with, I think the fact that I'm more comfortable with the use of English than Chinese is both limiting and liberating. A lot of translators, they translate from a foreign language into their first language. This is a more common practice, I suppose. But for me, I feel actually the creative force works better when I'm translating from something in my first language into English. And in the process, very often I learn to, I discover how to express in English things that I would not even pay attention to normally, because it's in my culture, in common practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens all the time. You know, an example that readily comes to mind for me is I was translating a poem about measure words or noun classifiers. And in Chinese, right, every noun, when you're going to count it, you have to put some kind of word in front of it to classify it. Sometimes we have these in English, like a piece of paper, but we can just say a person. We don't have to say a good person, right? It's just a person. So when I was translating this poem by Xixi about nouns with mismatched noun classifiers, I had a couple of problems because often these classifiers become invisible in English. So how can I mismatch them if we don't even have them in English? But what I discovered when I was doing research to get some inspiration is that English has a lot of very weird noun classifiers. We usually use them for groups of animals. And there's even a book that James Lipton wrote, An Exaltation of Larks, about this. So that was very interesting to me, and in fact, in the process of translating this poem, I wrote my own poem in response in English that Tammy published in her journal. And it was a way of me working through some of the strangeness of the English that wasn't appropriate to put in my translation because it had nothing to do with Xixi, but it was just part of my response. It was like, why do we say like an unkindness of ravens? You know, just some weird things, and they're really, really bizarre ones. And I realized, okay, it's not just with Chinese, we do have them, we just use them sometimes differently.
Yeah, we say a school of fish, a
Yeah.
pride of lions. That's about as far as my knowledge of that domain goes, but it's true.
A crash of rhinoceroses.
Is that?
Jennifer, it's good that you mentioned your poem, your translation of Cixi's poem, Can We Say, which is, as you were saying, the mismatch between classifiers and countable nouns. And I think Cixi is, apart from being playful and humorous with her language use, she's also suggesting how we can challenge accepted, received forms of how language is constructed. And I think in your translation, I wish you could read your translation. Okay, because it's, Jennifer is very creative in translating these mismatches into English. And I read it recently with my students, and we just marveled at how creative Jennifer is.
It's terrifying. I think of people reading and analyzing your translations. Don't do that.
And about linguistic specificity, I'm interested in asking another question of Lucas here, because you say that you're currently translating Li Shangli, who is famously difficult for Chinese readers. Right? When you read a Li Shangli poem, maybe you have this sort of vague impression of something very beautiful going on, but you don't know what it's about. And maybe you read the commentary, which takes pages and pages, but you don't know which parts of the commentary to believe, and so on. So you have a lot of material to work with when you're translating Li Shangli. And I can imagine one policy of translation that says, forget about the commentary and the footnotes and the detective work, and just give the impression of the beautiful poem. And another one that says, let's be ultra scholarly about this and try to chase every rabbit down to its hole. Where do you fall on this spectrum?
Well, that really depends on the writer that I'm dealing with at the moment, and what I want that translation to do. And what I've looked at with Li Shangyan is actually, and I wouldn't do this if I were translating Long Way. I would want to sort of have just the crystallization of the images and the illusions, which aren't all that serious or aren't that maybe distracting in Long Way. I wouldn't do this with Long Way, but in translating Li Shangyan, I think that the illusions and the elusiveness and the elusiveness and the elusiveness are much more part of the poetic process, and that relationship between the poem and the reader that's very present there for Chinese readers reading it today, and probably was present there for Chinese readers reading it over 1,000 years ago. That what I've tried to do, and we'll see how successful I am as I do more of these and sort of create the conditions for appreciating what I'm doing as I do them. Is that there's a lot of poetry in English that's very obscure, dense, elusive. You read it and you don't necessarily know what's going on. In fact, readers of poetry, I think, readers of poetry in English who read the kind of poems that I read are very comfortable not understanding a poem, right? You're very used to not really getting everything. And we're used to maybe being asked to come back to the poem, and maybe it's not worth it, right? You don't always want to do that, but we are, we're comfortable with that feeling. And actually, what I think is interesting is that there's a history of poems becoming more and more difficult that is linked right up with the history of Chinese translation appearing, English language poetry being drawing off of Chinese, right? You get it in Ezra Pound or you get it in J.H. Prynne, right? If you want to go further back, maybe Coleridge, Kubla Khan, and this is a poem about China that's famously nonsensical, right? And that whole history, when you trace it out, these things are often enmeshed together. And so I think that by sort of diving into that kind of tradition and seeing what possibilities are there, maybe allows for some things. There's a tradition of pseudo-translations, right? And pseudo-translations often take advantage of ugly language, distracting sort of diacritical marks or footnotes and things like that, and then find literary joy in that. And so what I'm trying to do with this process is create what I, sort of pseudo-translations, right? Translations that are real translations, but that you think are pseudo-translations. And maybe bringing, the annotation into the poem itself and some of the conflicting kind of interpretations of certain lines. There's one I've done where you're probably aware of the Li Xiangyin poem where the spring silkworms, they die and then there's no more silk, right? This is the line, and it uses that's not my written translation. That's yeah. I know, he's so difficult, right? What does that mean? But the idea is that si, right, meaning silk, but also meaning thinking or remembering or reminiscing on someone. And some people think that that's a link, but other scholars have said no, that's not it at all. And so you just put both of those annotations right there into the poem, in smaller text, and say, and let the annotations, let the commentary sort of fight it out on its own. Don't, like I said, it's not my job to interpret it, but it's there to say to the reader, you can figure it out. You can enjoy or not this debate that these different annotations are having together. But I wouldn't do that with everybody. I think that that takes a particular kind of a particular kind of poet and a particular kind of set of resonances to create.
Another question, which maybe I'll direct to Tasha. Do you feel that the product of your translation reads as being in any way Chinese or Chinese inflected to an audience that doesn't know Chinese but maybe has some preconceptions about China and Chinese writers? Do you have an anticipatory sense of the audience reading the writing, and is its local origin very important all the time, or is it sometimes one of those things that can vanish into the background?
I think that probably depends to a certain extent on the piece that's being translated, for sure. It's definitely not at the forefront of my mind when translating that it has to, or definitely not that it has to sound translated. I mean, as Lucas was saying, that's certainly not the intention. And I think a sense of place in a writing is important, but I think that's really often conveyed by the events of the story and where it's set and what the characters are doing. So I don't think in that sense it has to be obvious from the way the language is. In fact, I'd say I'd like the language to read fluently, and obviously there's that often remarked upon ideal of having something read as fluently in the translated as it does in the original. So no, I don't think I try to create Chinese inflections, but I do notice that it sort of links a bit, I guess, to the footnote question of whether if a word exists in Chinese like kang for the daybed where people sit and eat, should you leave it as kang in the English because we don't have an equivalent, so we couldn't there's not a word we can substitute, or should you say daybed or something like that? And obviously by leaving kang or some kind of word in the text, then you are leaving traces of Chinese, and I think it does depend on the story, but I think the most recent occurrence I had of dealing with that was to do the thing of leaving it in the word with a kind of flag to say what it is within that paragraph, but then letting that sit there as an obviously Chinese word that I guess helped ground it in a location.
Jennifer, I mean, I was thinking your crab cannon poem, right, which is a very clever poem, and your translation is extremely clever too, in picking up the ways that it's imitating music. In a way, it's already a translation from music, you could claim,
Yes.
right? And you're retranslating the translation.
Yes.
But you know, in some sense, this is independent of a very thick version of culture, wouldn't it be? What
Yes.
do you think?
Before I talk about the translation, your question and then her answer made me think of something. A friend of mine who's lives in the U.S., writes in English, but came there from Thailand via Hong Kong. So she's a Chinese, Thai, American writer, young, so starting out. And she was talking about in a writing workshop how she was criticized because she was writing about characters who were Thai or Chinese, but she did not flag them as such. And her writing instructors would say, well, can't you say the character has black hair so we know that it's a Chinese person? And she found this incredibly offensive. And this made me think of that, because this sense of, do we want to flag these texts as the other? Is that important? And some of the reactions I've had when I've done public readings of Xi-Xi's poetry in the US is, that doesn't sound like Chinese poetry. She's writing poems about Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg, and there's not a lot of Chinese stuff in there. And like, you don't know anything about Hong Kong or contemporary Chinese poetry, do you? I mean, all of these, all of these writers are in dialogue with things beyond so-called Chineseness. So when I'm translating, I'm not deliberately trying to make something seem Chinese or not Chinese, right? And it really is a case-by-case thing. I mean, in some of her poems, they're very much about Hong Kong, and she's naming neighborhoods, so you would know it's about Hong Kong. But I don't deliberately try to add that or to erase that. And I think maybe what we need to be doing is translating more of these texts that challenge readers' preconceptions about what they think contemporary Chinese language literature is.
Just realized there's a small addition to that point, that I actually came across that issue in this particular section that I just read out loud, because when the loudspeaker plays the song on the train, it's the weird song about a kitten flying around a boat, and so I was looking up this this quote, and the internet is a great thing, and it told me that it's actually a Chinese nursery rhyme about a seagull. So what she's done is just make it nonsensical by replacing the seagull with a kitten. So then I did have the issue of thinking, okay, should I just pick a well-known Western nursery rhyme and just replace the lamb in Mary Had a Little Lamb, that was my idea, with a kitten. And it sounded quite good, and it did fit really well because the lamb is white, and then this seagull is also white. But then ultimately I just thought that was maybe a step too far of taking the story out of its context. Like, it would be, I think it would be confusing, so I decided not to do that.
The sort of to explain why I read the poem that I read too, this may be the opposite sort of example, right? There's a line here in 西川有一群百姓, I'll read it in Mandarin, I hope that's okay. 有一群百姓像白菜一样翠绿, which I think is a great line, right? 像白菜一样翠绿, but and you get a real engagement with a lot of things that are very common in Chinese culture, 白菜, right? 翠绿 as a sort of a color, 百姓. And these are three words that are actually very difficult to translate into English. And what I did there is I said there's a crowd of commoners as purple as red cabbage. And so you don't have that sense of the Chinese cultural resonances at all. But I do have, right, 白菜. I've always wondered why it's called 白菜too. It's not actually white, is it? And Xifan points that out, right? It's 翠绿. So I drew back on my confusions with English, and why don't we call it purple cabbage? Why do we call it red cabbage? Well, so there you go. And fortunately, they're both vegetables. They're both cabbagey, kind of vegetables. But there are times when I do feel like, sometimes your reader does want to learn something about China, right? And that doesn't mean that you should feed them their preconceptions, but actually you should, feed them. You should not feed them their preconceptions, but so that they can learn something about China as maybe the writer believes it is. I don't think it's a bad thing to turn to literature to learn something about real places and real people. It's not the only thing there, but I think that if you only go to literature for some sort of transcendent beauty, I think you can miss out a lot too. So I always think this is a negotiation that comes down to the particular kinds of problems that the word itself gives you, or the line itself gives you, and then you've got to figure out how to solve it.
How about audiences? When I think about translation, translation from Chinese into English doesn't have such a long history, right? Nor does translation from English into Chinese. At the most, we're talking about 200 years, more or less, right? That's not a lot of time for two languages to get acquainted. But I think within our generation, in the last 30 or 40 years, there are an increasing number of people who can read sophisticated texts in both languages and do it all the time. This is very different from a situation when the expert was the person who took a text in English and presented it to the Chinese public in a certain way, or the expert taking the Chinese text, presenting it to the English-speaking public, and there was only that very narrow channel of an expert, one of the few translators like Whaley or Pound or someone who could do it. And of course, Pound wasn't really doing it off his own bat anyway. So what does this do to the situation that we're in now? That there are so many people who can also do this thing, but also who can appreciate the thing that you're doing, right? Who can look at the poem translated by Tammy or by Jennifer, or the story translated by Tasha, or the poem translated by Lucas, and say, aha, I see what you did there. I might have done it a little bit differently, right? I mean, that's a very interesting situation to be in, particularly because it's so new as a fact about these two languages.
I would like to share my experience. It's only actually in recent years that I realized so many people are fluently bilingual, Mandarin and English, especially seeing my co-panelists here. And when I translate works from Chinese into English, I'm very aware of the fact that if they have time, if they find my work interesting, they will be reading. And this is actually very intimidating for me, translating from Chinese into English, or sometimes from English into Chinese. But I think the exchange is also very interesting. In fact, when I now translate something from Chinese into English or vice versa, and if in a moment of doubt, I actually consult Lucas, for example, to help me out with the subtlety of the expressions, for example. So I think perhaps because I haven't been a translator for a long period of time, and just in recent years, being in Hong Kong and being in touch with scholars, critics, and translators who are so good in both languages, also helped me in trying to explore more and to do more.
I have to say, I agree it's great having a lot of people to consult, but I am also often secretly pleased that it's a lot less common for prose to get printed with one side Chinese and one side English, because I think poets have it quite hard in that respect. One thing I would say is not so much about audience, but I would say that I do some translation in Hong Kong for Dorothy, who's in the audience. And one thing that I found really, really helpful is the fact that Dorothy speaks and reads really good English. So as a translator, having the author be able to read what you've done in English. I know sometimes I've talked to other translators who've had problems with that, but I find that for what we were talking about right at the start about the responsibility of taking on an author's work, that for me has been really fantastic. And also really good for example, there was once a phrase where two characters are put together that I had never seen put together before, and I searched various dictionaries and tried to come up with a translation, and they kind of both meant dry. And then I met Dorothy and talked about it, and she was describing that she had made up the combination, and that what she wanted them to mean was that getting into a bed felt like when you bite a piece of lemon. I thought that was really great that we could have that conversation, and then you can kind of sort of brainstorm together the difficult parts of somebody's story.
I mean, I think about audience a lot, and it can depend on the context. So for example, if I'm going to send a poem off to a literary journal, I need it to be as good as it can be. I know it's being judged as a poem in English. People aren't saying, oh, that's a poem by so-and-so, a great Chinese writer. They have no idea who the writer is. So it has to be as good as it can be. In terms of having things published bilingually, it is a bit scary because there are people, usually native speakers of Chinese, who are fond of, on social media, putting them side by side and critiquing them. I've seen this happen with other books by Zephyr. And I had this in mind when I was doing this book. I thought, oh, so-and-so, I just know one day he's gonna like publicly critique this. That's what he likes to do. And it can be scary because we think a lot about every single word we put. And if there's a word that seems different from the Chinese, there's a reason. It's not sometimes we do make mistakes, it happens, and you look at it in print and you're horrified. You know, so for example, I'm translating a poem that hinges on a homophone between mei li in Mandarin. In Cantonese, it's a near homophone. So mei li as in beautiful, mei li is in a transliteration of Murray, which is a place, a building. If I translate mei li as beautiful, and I translate the poem as the beautiful building, there's no confusion because beautiful and Murray don't sound alike. So I changed it to Mary, M-E-R-R-Y, and I can just imagine some guy down the road saying, she doesn't know Chinese, she doesn't know what mei li means, but there's a reason there. So I do keep that in mind. Something else about audience. There was a poem I was translating by Xixi called Excerpts from a Feminist Dictionary, and the first stanza seems to very much be using gender-neutral language. So we get to this line where she uses an older form of the word for courtesan, where instead of having the woman radical, it's the person radical. And I thought, oh, that seems very striking to me. I've never seen that before. And I contacted Xixi via her friend Hufuren because Xixi cannot do email due to a medical issue. And he didn't even check with Xixi. He just said, oh, that's just the older form of the word. It doesn't mean anything. And then I consulted with a good friend of mine who's a native Cantonese speaker, native Mandarin speaker, and very fluent in English. And she said, you have to keep the reader in mind. And I read this poem, and it's weird to me to see this word for courtesan with the person radical. And I, as a reader, am demanding that you make it strange in English because it's really strange to me in English. And it does, I mean in Chinese, and it does emphasize that gender neutrality. And she's like, you can't just think of the author, you have to think of us readers too.
How did you resolve that one?
Well, what I did is I went to Facebook, which is great for crowdsourcing translation questions. I think probably a lot of people up here. I said, what are ways to say prostitute? And I did some internet searches, which would give me a very sketchy search history if the FBI ever came after me. And then what I ended up doing is, you know, there's the expression "ladies of the night," and I put a backslash after LAD, so it could be ladies of the night or lads of the night, because and a friend of mine read it and said, oh, that seems very much like E.E. Cummings, who actually is a big influence on Xixi's poetry, totally coincidental, but I'll pretend it was totally intentional.
Yeah, another question is influence, right? How do you represent influence? Because, I mean, there you had a lucky accident.
Yeah.
E.E. Cummings was in the background somehow, and unconsciously you found him and put him back there, as it were. But what about other cases where what's being written in the original language means something because it's got this very specific relation, or an audible, let's just say an audible, right, a recognizable relation to something that, to a writer or a tradition that's not in the language you're translating into? How do you compensate for that? I mean, if you can, of course.
Me? Okay.
Well, how does one?
I mean, this is what I think is really interesting. There's a translation theorist, Lawrence Venuti, who's written about this, about how translation presents a unique form of intertextuality, and that you're not just the text isn't just decontextualized, but you're recontextualizing it. And this might mean you're forming these new relationships. So if you're, he uses the example of translating like this gangster novel from Italian into English. So he's trying to find the same kind of register in English and maybe trying to allude to different texts in English so that the English language reader can feel that connection. And I think some similar things happen. So there was a poem I was translating that plays around with Japanese kanji and Chinese. And so immediately it stood out to me that there are words in here that are Japanese that Chinese people today don't use. I mean, the title of the poem was a hint because it's the male name Ichiro. And it opens talking about cherry blossoms. And for me, when I think about cherry blossoms in English, I always come back to A.E. Housman. And when I was really stuck on translating things, I found myself going to him, and it occurred to me that maybe Shishi was referencing him because there are some lines very similar to his poems, and it wouldn't be unexpected that she was referencing him. But even if she wasn't, I thought I want to create the intertextual relationship in English because I'm sure I'm not the only reader who thinks of Housman, and it was just too hard not to do. So that's a case where I don't know that I was representing her influence by somebody, but I added that influence because I thought it was appropriate. And I don't think I was overstepping a boundary because I think it fits so much with the line of the poem.
So let's talk a little bit more about the audience for translation, because we have on the podium people who edit journals and who are involved in making a readership for translation and for the works that are being translated. How challenging is that? Does that often feel like a walk uphill against a strong wind? What can readers do to make it easier, other than, of course, buy the journals and the books? But how can we create a milieu for this to happen?
Thank you very much. I edited a journal based in Hong Kong. It is an online journal called Cha, T in English. And in recent years, we tried very hard to publish translations because we think it is because of the online medium platform, it would be perfect to have poems presented bilingually. And so when we first thought of this idea, my co-editor and I had to discuss with our webmaster to see how we can present the poems in both English and Chinese. And the reality, however, is that we don't actually receive a lot of translation submissions. Maybe this is because of our lack of effective promotion or copyright issue. Because you see, the translation of classical poems, classical Chinese poems, because there are so many available versions out there, and this fact actually deters a lot of writers to retranslate already translated works. And whereas newer writings, perhaps there's a lack of means to acquire this copyright. The copyright to translate. So on the one hand, we really want to publish more translated works and present them bilingually on our website. But at the same time, we are also finding actually difficulties in getting more submissions from writers and translators.
So one thing would be to encourage writers to encourage the translators, right? Yeah, make them understand the importance of having a broad, diverse international audience. Of course, I think any author would jump at the chance to expand the audience. Right? I believe we have just 1 minute left on the podium because there's another event here at 8 o'clock. So we can't really stay here all night, much though I might like to. But do any of you have something that you were wanting to say and haven't had a chance to say yet? No? All right. I want to thank you on behalf of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival and the University of Chicago Center in Hong Kong for coming and attending this event. I hope you feel that you learned a lot. I certainly did, and I'm grateful to our panelists. Thank you.